here today with a little history lesson for you. I'm going to be talking about the difference between knitting and crochet. So, knitting, 2 pointy needles. Crochet, 1 curved hook. There you have it. Bye. Okay, clearly it is a little more complicated than that, and we are going to get into that today. But for practical purposes, if you personally are not a fiber artist and you are on public transportation or somewhere else and you see somebody doing something with yarn and you're wondering whether it's knitting or crochet, this is the answer. Crochet requires 1 curved hook. Knitting requires 2 or more pointy needles. They may be connected in the middle by a cable like this, but there are still 2 ends and they are pointy. 1 crochet hook. So that's the very basics of it. The simple, easy to see difference between knitting and crochet. But they are actually different in a lot of other ways, and their history is different. So let's go ahead and start talking about that today. So both of these crafts involve making fabric out of yarn by looping that yarn into itself. But knitting is the older one. The oldest evidence of knitting that we have is from about the 11th century. If you search for this, what you're going to find are what's called the Coptic socks. These are some socks that were discovered in Egypt. And I will do a little picture in here for you. As you can see, especially if you are an experienced knitter, these are not just like a plain sock. These are very intricate. So chances are that these date to about 1000 CE. Chances are knitting was invented before that because you don't make fancy color work socks perfectly the first time you do it. But because all of the things that are used to knit, so cotton, silk, wool, at least at the time when it was invented, are very biodegradable, we don't have a lot of evidence. So this is the oldest evidence we have of actual knitting, and it is about 1,000 years old. There's another technique called nail binding, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, which creates a fabric similar to knitting that greatly predates knitting, but they're actually different. The fabric is similar, but if you look at examples of fabric created through this nail binding, whatever technique, it looks like all of the stitches are twisted. And it is created in a different way. It's created, I think, with like a thread that's being pulled through loops on like a one single needle. Sometimes it's called single needle knitting, but they are not the same. They may be connected, however. Again, all of these things are very biodegradable, so we just don't know, the exact history of them. Because the original sort of garment crafting technique was weaving, that is thousands of years old, and it developed independently in different civilizations. Knitting seems to have developed in the Middle East approximately 1,000 years ago, give or take a few hundred years for developing the skill. Crochet is much younger. The earliest actual evidence we have of crochet is from the 19th century. That doesn't mean that's when it started, because again, these materials are very biodegradable, but we don't have any evidence of it existing before that. We do have evidence of some of what we believe are its precursors. One is an embroidery technique called tambour embroidery. So crochet may have developed from that. There's also evidence of a style of a slip stitch crochet that seems to have developed a little bit earlier. They have been used in Scotland and in Denmark. But actual evidence of crochet seems to of this particular word being used for this particular technique seems to first appear in the very early 19th century in some books talking about the technique and sharing patterns for it. So we don't know exactly when crochet developed. We do know that it is much younger than knitting, which is in turn much younger than weaving. So knitting, as I said, seems to have developed in the Middle East and then spread on trade routes. We have evidence of knitting in Europe by the 13th century. And originally it seems to have been used for kind of decorative items like pillowcases, little bags. A lot of it was done with silk, and wasn't really being used for practical purposes at first. It was more like adornments. By the 14th century, we see the appearance of what are called the knitting Madonnas, which are portrait paintings of the Virgin Mary knitting. And I'm gonna throw one in here. She seems to be knitting socks or something in the round because she has 4 needles. So we definitely know by then that knitting has spread to Europe, but at this point it is not something that sort of the common person is doing, which again might be why we are seeing it here in a portrait of such an important figure as the Virgin Mary. This was still something that was reserved for skilled craftsmen to be creating, and mostly for the wealthy. So by the mid 16th century, Europe seems to, I'm going to say, reinvent the purl stitch. So the Coptic socks appear to have a short row heel, which means that the Egyptians knew how to purl. But purling had not made its way to Europe. So whether it took this long to spread there, or someone eventually just kind of figured it out once they had the basics of knitting, we don't really know. But this is sort of a really revolutionary point. Because if you don't know how to purl, either everything is garter stitch or everything has to be worked in the round. And a lot of what was being created was being worked in the round. But things are just not going to be as versatile if you only have the knit stitch. So we reinvent the purl stitch in the 16th century, and then things really take off from here. So now we are seeing knitting being used for stockings, and a lot of them, and very fancy ones. So again, this is something that is still produced by very skilled and trained craftspeople for the wealthy. Silk stockings that now have a heel and probably some kind of ribbing to hold them up. There's evidence, remaining consistent evidence of stockings from this period that were being knit at 25 stitches and 32 rows per inch. That's insane. That is absolutely insane. And of course it was being done by hand because machine knitting has not been invented yet. So these silk stockings are hand knit. This is going to be just hours and hours and hours of very arduous labor. There's no magic loop. There's no circular needles. We've got long pointy sticks. That's it. So again, these items are being reserved for the wealthy. These are very expensive. And a lot of the historians that I looked at for this mentioned that this is a period where men are kind of wearing like the short pants that kind of fall to the knee, and then the very long stockings underneath. So here, this is really going to be like a prominent part of their wardrobe because everybody's going to see it. This isn't like our socks today. 15th to 16th century, we are finally learning the purl stitch. We're making very fancy stockings. We don't have sweaters yet. I did a whole, another video about the history of sweaters that you can find. Actually, I switched the camera, so I think it's here. We don't have sweaters yet. And again, this is crafting things for the nobility, so we don't have sort of basic things like hats and mittens yet. But this is right around the time where the skill of knitting is starting to move beyond the skilled craftspeople and being picked up by commoners. And that is when we are starting to see more utilitarian things and things being made out of wool. So all of the early knitting from Egypt, that was done in cotton. The fancy knitting for the wealthy, that was done in silk. But now we're moving into wool. There's much more wool and it's much less expensive. And here is really, where it takes off. Everybody's learning to knit. And we have a lot more migration starting during this period, even, over to the New World. So this is really kind of the explosion of knitting becoming for almost everything and almost everybody. And it's also the time where we're seeing different distinct styles developing, sort of the styles from the Aran Islands and the Shetland Islands and the Scandinavian knitting. Everybody has this skill and is just playing around with it and developing their own looks. So from there, knitting spreads out everywhere. And, since then it has waxed and waned. Eventually the Industrial Revolution happens. We have machine knitting. And now, especially in the age of athleisure, the vast majority of our garments are knit rather than being woven. They're still machine knit. They're not knit by hand. But they're still a knit fabric. At some point, pretty much every woman was taught to knit. Then that was no longer necessary. Then it came back to being a hobby. There were periods of time where women picked up knitting because it was a way to make some extra money. That has really gone back and forth. The popularity of hand knitting, waxes and wanes. But now it's everywhere. And that's sort of the brief history of knitting. Crochet, again, since we don't know where it really came from, we don't know how it really spread out. The first evidence we have of it in the English language is from the 19th century. In terms of the word crochet, we know that it is developed from the Middle French word for hook. So that makes perfect sense, and it is called crochet in most places in Europe, most Romance language speaking places in Europe, but it also goes by a few other names. So I can tell you that in Spanish, sometimes tejer is used for both knitting and crochet and weaving. It can get very confusing. But to make a distinction, sometimes they still use crochet in Spanish, and also tejera ganchillo, which is the hook. Ganchillo. We have a lot less history for crochet. I was able to find out that in some places, early forms of crochet were also called shepherd's knitting because of the hook that looks, I suppose, like a shepherd's staff. We don't think that knitting and crochet, we don't think that crochet developed from knitting, but we don't exactly know where it came from. It could have even come from nail binding. We don't know, but we don't think that crochet did not develop out of knitting. In terms of how it got to the US, the prevailing theory tends to be that Irish immigrants brought it to the US during the largest wave of immigration from Ireland. It had been picked up already in Ireland at that point, and during the famine that prompted a lot of Irish immigrants to move to the US, it was something that women often did to try to make extra money. So our history of crochet is not as extensive as our history of knitting, and our history of knitting is really not that extensive to begin with. So we've got some general ideas. We have a lot of theories. We have very few solid answers. But there is your general history of knitting and crochet. Let's talk about the differences between knitting and crochet. Obviously, the big difference that is visible to most people, knitting, pointy sticks, crochet, curved hook. But there are some other ones as well. So knitting is generally done on open stitches. So you can see on the cable of my needle here, all of these stitches are open. they're a little loop, and I will work into each loop to continue knitting. For most forms of crochet, you only have one open stitch that you are actively working with, and to create the next stitch, when you create the next stitch, you are going to close off the current stitch. So you saw on the knitting needle, all of those loops were open and I can work into them. Everything here is already closed, so I'm going to insert the hook into an existing stitch that has already been closed. So I only have one active stitch. So practically, what does that mean? If I take this loop off my hook, nothing's gonna happen. It's just sitting there. I might kind of extend it out, just, you know, so that it doesn't go anywhere, but I take it off and nothing happens. If I pull it out, I'm going to undo the things I've just done. But that's all. That's all. So nothing in the rest of my, in this case, blanket is changing if the current stitch that I am utilizing is pulled out. So let's say I'm knitting and this next stitch falls off the needle. So you can see it's unraveling. It could unravel all the way back to the beginning. It's not going to, because I'm going to fix it. But because knitting is worked over quote unquote open stitches, dropping a stitch can lead to quite a lot of unraveling. So that's another major difference between the two. The last major difference between the two is the kind of fabric that it makes. So this is a knit fabric. This is kind of a heavy yarn, but it's very drapey. It's very stretchy. So it's very versatile, and depending on how thick your yarn is and what kind of stitches you're using, you can create lots of sort of different kinds of fabric. This crochet fabric, you can see, it's very dense. It's very textured. It doesn't stretch nearly as much as the knitting. It is not as versatile a fabric, particularly when we're talking about garments. That's not to say that changing up your kind of yarn, the fiber content of your yarn won't impact that. It certainly will. But generally speaking, a crocheted fabric tends to be denser and less flexible. There are pros and cons to that. So if you want a kind of like summery open work garment, crochet is a good choice for that because it really holds that shape well. If you try to knit something open work with knitting, you can, depending on the fiber and your stitches, but it has a much harder time retaining that openness. It tends to squeeze back in because it is so stretchy. Whereas if you are crocheting, it tends to hold that kind of openness a little more readily. So they create two different kinds of fabric that both have their uses. In terms of the actual craft, crochet uses more yarn to create an equal amount of fabric. Because of the way that the stitches work, it tends to develop more quickly. So again, I'll use an example. This is my very first crochet project. This is a blanket, and this part here is 3 rows of crochet of, I don't even remember if it's single or double crochet, whatever it is. Double crochet, I think. This is 3 rows, and it is about 1.5 inches, and that's worsted weight yarn. This is also worsted weight yarn. 3 rows here is that between my 2 thumbs. Come on, there we go. That's 3 rows. That's it. That's maybe 1/2 inch. Again, both are the same weight of yarn. So crochet tends to work up more quickly. It uses more yarn, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what your goal is. If you've got a lot of yarn that you're trying to get rid of, a crochet project is a good way to do that. Knitting can be done by a machine. Crochet cannot. So if you go to Target or Shein or Temu or all the fast fashion places and you see crochet, all of it is done by hand. There is no way to crochet by a machine, at least so far. So knitting can be done by hand, and when you get your fuzzy hats and things at the store, those are all machine knit. You're not going to be seeing a lot of hand knitting in stores because one, we don't have to. We can machine knit, and machines are cheaper than paying a salary. And two, because hand knitting takes such a long time. It's much faster to do it with a machine. So crochet, as I said, always done by hand, never done by machine. It is faster than knitting, so I will say that. But it is still a lot of work, work by hand. And if you're buying things at Target that are crocheted for $10, nobody's getting paid a fair wage. It's just impossible. And then the last big question that I think always comes up when we're talking about knitting versus crochet, which one is easier? I think it just depends a lot on which one you learn first. Both of them ultimately involve developing a muscle memory, just like typing or playing piano or playing guitar. Eventually, after you have been doing them and practicing for a while, you're going to be able to do it almost automatically, probably without looking, and it's going to seem easy to you. Right now, because I have been knitting for 17 years and I have been crocheting for 1 year, knitting seems a lot easier to me. That said, having already developed a knitting skill, I think picking up the crochet was a little easier because I sort of, understand about yarn management and holding the tools and things like that. But even so, I'm very slow and it is not, I've been working on this blanket for like 6 months. It is not fast for me yet, but I know that if I keep practicing, then someday it will be. So I don't think it's a matter of one being easier than the other. The basic skill of looping yarn around to create a fabric, whether you're using needles or whether you're using a crochet hook, ultimately just requires practice. Now, because the knitting is a more versatile fabric and it can be used for a lot of things, you may find that knitting patterns are more complex. There's a lot more moving parts and things going on, simply because more complex garments and things tend to be made from knitting and not crochet. So in that regard, crafting the actual garments, the knitting process may be more involved, have more steps, have more, moving parts. But the actual act of knitting or crochet, I don't think necessarily one is easier than the other. I would love to hear your opinion if you do both. As I said, I barely do crochet. I mostly just do knitting. But essentially you're going to develop a muscle memory to do either one, and then both of them are going to seem relatively easy once you get going. I definitely encourage you, if you are not already a knitter or a crocheter, hooker, to look into it. They are both wonderful crafts. Thank you again for joining me for today's video. I hope you learned something about the history of knitting and crochet. If you did enjoy the video, I hope you will give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. New videos, mostly about knitting, every Saturday. If you are looking for me on social media, you can find me on Instagram and Ravelry as Media Padawana, and I will see you next time.